ready to start.
We're ready to go on this very exciting topic called
trade.
And as we learned from our video last week, it maybe isn't as simple as we've made it out to be.
Unfortunately. Yeah. As much fun as it was stealing Katie's candy from her.
Tariffs.
Right. We're going to learn what that means today. Yeah. But anyways, thank you guys for joining us. We appreciate it. And we're going to jump right in and start sharing the screen so that you guys can see what we have going on our trade webinar today. All right. So agricultural trade is a very big deal. Right, Katie?
It is.
It is. Yep. And if I can go to the next slide, there we go. Before we get started, though, and really launch into it, one of the things that I've realized as I talk especially to high school students about trade is that they tend to know a lot of terms, but don't really know what those terms mean. That's definitely true, like when I'm doing public speaking competitions or extemporaneous speaking competitions. Like, we've all heard these terms before, but then we start to use them and realize, oh, I don't actually know how to use it because I don't know what it means.
And then somebody asks us a question about it. You're like, well, I knew the word. Don't I get credit for that?
Exactly.
Right? But I actually don't know. And that happens to me as well. So I'm really glad that you have this slide up.
That's right. So before we even get started into anything, I wanted to define these two terms especially. The first term is commodity, and this is a term that I learned a lot and we talked a lot about when I was doing econ classes and that kind of thing. But a commodity is basically something that is interchangeable. So the farmer that grows it down the road, you can't tell the difference between his crop and the farmer that grows it in the next county.
Like corn.
Exactly. Right?
Cotton.
Once the corn all goes into that bin, you can't tell the difference. Once the cotton goes to the gin, you can't tell the difference between that cotton. So it's basically interchangeable. The second term that I really wanted to define, because we hear it a lot in the news, we hear it everywhere, and a lot of people don't know what it is, but that term is a tariff. And so a tariff is a tax that we impose on something that we import or import into the country or export out of the country. So, for example, if I'm an American cotton producer and I want Chinese cotton to be more expensive than my American cotton, I would urge the government to impose a tariff on Chinese cotton, right? Because that means that the moment that cotton from China comes into our country, it's whatever that tariff is % more expensive.
Okay.
So if there's an 8% tariff, that cotton is automatically taxed with an extra 8%. And so for someone to buy that, it's going to cost them an additional 8% than it would have.
Makes sense.
So that's going to make that product theoretically more expensive than the product that they could buy domestically or even from another country if that's what
And a question on that tariff. So your cotton example, right? So we're going to import cotton from China.
Right.
Okay. And we have a 8% tariff on it. So the 8% tax. Who gets that 8% tax?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a government thing. So it's just like a tax where it goes into government coffers. So
our government.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Gotcha.
Our government gets that tax.
Gotcha.
So keep those two terms in mind because we're going to use them a lot through the presentation, and we wanted to make sure that we were very clear on what those terms were before we got started. All right. So why is trade a big deal? We hear about it a lot. We see it in the news. We talk about it. But really, like, what's the nitty-gritty and what does it boil down to? So I think that one of the things we lose sight of when we talk about trade is the fact that we really do live in a global economy, right? And agriculture is a great example of that because we can't grow every food in every part of the world, right? Strawberries grow really great in Florida, not so much in Nebraska.
Right.
But people in Nebraska still want to eat strawberries.
Yeah.
So we've got to get them from somewhere, right? The Midwest can grow corn really, really well, and corn kind of grows everywhere, but the Midwest grows it really well, which means they have more than they need. So they can't just sit on that. They need to send it somewhere. They need to ship it somewhere that people do need it, where that demand actually exists. And Yuma's a great example too, right? They grow a ton of produce, fresh vegetables, leafy greens in the wintertime because you can't grow them in Buffalo, New York in the wintertime because it's a barren tundra of wasteland. I've never been there.
Frozen.
I just assume that based on all of the football games that I see being played there, right?
Yeah.
So there you go. So the other reason that food is really priced globally, or that trade is important for food, is that because we trade it globally, that means it's priced globally. So it might not just be what's happening in the United States that determines the price of corn grown in the United States. It's what's happening everywhere that determines the price of corn that's being grown in the United States. Then finally, 95% of the world lives outside of our states, right? 95% of the world lives outside of the country. So
that's kind of a staggering statistic because I think we tend to
Right.
kind of focus on your own, right? It's where we live, and we think we're everybody, but wow,
But we're not.
5%.
And so knowing that, if we limit ourselves to not being able to trade to those consumers and sell to those consumers, we really don't have much of a market share anymore. And so if we're going to continue to thrive, not just as an agricultural industry, but as a global economy, we really have to make sure that we are taking advantage of trade as much as we possibly can. Agriculture is really good at that. We're one of the only industries in the United States that exports more than we import. So we have what's called a trade surplus. And a ton of our farm income, because of that, is based on that export market.
So we're so efficient at producing the things that we do.
Exactly. So it's a big deal to make sure that agriculture has access to international markets on a free and a fair basis. So one of the ways that we do that as a nation is something called a free trade agreement. Another term that I think gets thrown around a lot that we've heard about, but maybe we don't know the nitty-gritty of what a free trade agreement actually looks like. So what it is an agreement between countries. It can be bilateral, which means it's just two countries together, like America and Japan, for example, or it can be multinational. So something like NAFTA, which was the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, right?
Yeah.
So it can be any number of countries, and it's an agreement between those countries to say, all right, we're going to identify what's making it difficult for us to trade with one another, and we're going to eliminate those trade barriers so that we can have, a nice free flow of goods between our countries. Sounds really simple, but obviously it gets pretty complicated when you start talking about what markets are we trying to protect domestically, what are we actually trying to trade, what are the products that are really important.
The politics of it.
Exactly. Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the easiest things, or one of the most obvious things that free trade agreements usually do, is they address reducing or eliminating tariffs altogether, so that we don't have those taxes of goods when they're coming across the border, right? Another thing that, especially in modern day, is really important in trade agreements is restrictions on subsidizing certain products, and agriculture gets into that a lot too, because we all sort of know, at least on a surface basis, what the Farm Bill is. And under the Farm Bill, we have certain ag products that have a safety net of funding so that farmers who grow those products are guaranteed a particular price, or they have a crop insurance program. You know, there's a lot that goes into the Farm Bill, but some countries look at that as an unfair propping up of certain markets. And the cotton market is a really good example of that. We actually got into trouble as a nation. Well, it was quite a while ago now, more than 10 years ago now, because of some of our programs with cotton. And so cotton was being subsidized according to a couple of countries that we were trading with. They didn't like how we were subsidizing that particular commodity. And so then we had to make some changes, and cotton actually was taken out of Farm Bill programs as a result of that because of trade. Right? Because the countries didn't like what we were doing there, saying that that was unfair. Again, you can agree or disagree with that, but
it is what it is.
That's right. Another thing that modern day trade agreements focus on quite a bit is regulations on labor. And this makes sense economically, because if a country can pay their workers $1 an hour to produce something, and we have to pay our workers $7.25 or more an hour,
obviously sell theirs for less.
That's right. And so that's going to put them at a pretty clear advantage over our products. And plus, it's just good ethics to pay people a living wage. And so if we want to be able as a country to encourage that kind of ethical treatment of people, we're going to do that. And if we can do that through trade and through free markets, then all the better. And then another thing that's important in trade agreements, especially modern day, sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, which is just a really fancy way of saying how do we inspect things when they come across the border to make sure that we don't have bad bugs, bad diseases, viruses, stuff that we don't want coming into our state or our nation. We got to make sure that if we're getting something from another country, it's not hanging out in whatever that shipment is. Agriculture is really, really dependent on that, especially when it comes to like insects and that kind of thing. So a couple examples of free trade agreements. Everyone knows NAFTA, right? We've heard it, even if we don't know what it is. That was the North American Free Trade Agreement. We'll talk about that in a little more detail as we go through. And then also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which that was an agreement between a multitude of East Asian countries and more Western countries, Australia, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, the United States. I'm sure I'm missing a few in
Wow.
that actually, but yeah, it was a very, very large.
TPP.
TPP is more fun instead of trying to create an acronym with all of that going on. And so that is another good example of a free trade agreement. We do have a question from the audience from AACEM, and it says, we have a question, and can you explain further subsidies and subsidization? Absolutely, we can. So let's take a farm bill iteration. It was probably 2 or 3 farm bills ago, but it's still similar in this. So if you have a crop like cotton, and our farmers, and they want to grow cotton in the United States, but it's risky to do that because the price of cotton is it fluctuates quite a bit, right? So in one year it might be 62 cents a pound, and then the next year it might be 43 cents a pound.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a very big deal. And so what the Farm Bill did, and what our government has decided to do, because we value the ability to produce that commodity here in the United States, is to create a safety net for that commodity. So the government has said, all right, we will guarantee that if you grow cotton, we will make sure that you are paid a certain price.
So if the market falls, you're guaranteed.
That's right.
A level.
And you can be guaranteed that level through a couple of things. That can be either a direct payment that literally makes up the difference between what you're paid and whatever that government floor price is. That's a lot less common now. Now the more common is something like a crop insurance program. So maybe we're not talking about the price of something, but we're saying this is a risky product to grow because you grow it in places that are prone to freezing or drought or floods or that kind of thing. And so through crop insurance, you're also sort of guaranteed that minimum price, but it's through you're paying a premium into it, and then you're claiming damages or losses once you actually harvest that product, and you harvest significantly less than you would have harvested if you didn't have that natural disaster or whatever the case may be. So basically a subsidization is the government saying we're going to protect you as a grower of this commodity to make sure that you know you're at least going to receive this price.
Can you give any other examples besides cotton?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole list of commodities that are covered in the Farm Bill. I probably should know that by heart and be able to just list it all off, which is okay. But there are greens that are covered. Cotton is one that's covered. I can absolutely get you that list. It's been a while since
one of the things, though, I think people are surprised when they learn about some of the ones that are not subsidized.
That's right.
Because a lot of people think with the Farm Bill, especially when it's kind of out there and being talked about in the media.
Debated,
Debated, I like that. A lot of people think literally everything is, like leafy greens, fresh produce, and those are some of the things that are not.
That's right. Not only are they not subsidized, like, cotton or grains or soybeans, they don't even have widespread crop insurance. And so those farmers really, really do put themselves at risk when they decide to grow those high value, high input type crops, which is another reason that free trade agreements are so important, because those are also the kinds of crops that you can't grow everywhere.
Right.
So having additional markets for that and knowing that you're going to have venues to sell that allows you to take that risk a little bit more heavily.
Makes sense. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. If not, choose another one.
It's a very good question. And honestly, we could do a whole other webinar on the Farm Bill, which I think might actually be on our list, which we should probably get that one going. But so going
back to trade.
Yeah, going back to trade, but they're all connected, so it's a great question. Katie, I do have a question for you. What do NAFTA and TPP have in common?
They don't exist anymore?
That's right. They don't exist anymore. And that's because free trade agreements are actually a little bit more controversial than you might think, right? As we're talking about them, it sounds really great because we're getting rid of tariffs and we're making sure that people are paid well and we're making sure that bugs and diseases are coming in. But they're not as straightforward as they seem. And I think that kind of leads us to one of the big questions that you could do if your team wanted to do a trade issue for an ag issues competition. And it's, are free trade agreements good for agriculture? You could probably even expand that to just say, are they good for the United States? Or in what ways are they good for the United States? But there's a couple of camps, right? So there's of course they're good for ag. They mean that we can expand our markets, we can sell to more countries at a more efficient rate. We're not having to pay tariffs on things that go out or come in. And it means that because we can get the best possible prices for our product and we can get products at the best possible prices, our consumers have lower food prices. And at the grocery store, that's what we all want, right? We all want to see that Thanksgiving dinner doesn't cost any more this year than it did last year.
That makes sense. So what's the flip side?
So the flip side of that is that as we're buying products from other countries, it means that we're buying products from other countries. So food production is going abroad, and we're becoming more and more dependent, if you want to use that word, or at least reliant on other countries for some of the food products that we get. That also means that jobs are going abroad because as more production goes to other countries, you have to have people to work in that production. And then finally, lower food prices are great for consumers, but they also mean that there's lower commodity prices for producers. And so it can be harder, like we talked about earlier, where it's not just what happens in the U.S. that determines crop prices, it's what happens everywhere. It could be a lot harder for that producer to get a premium price for their crop because of the ability to trade it internationally. Yeah. And so that's why, when we started talking about especially NAFTA and some free trade, that's why we heard a lot of these things in the news. And it was because when a new administration came into the White House in 2016, that administration had a slightly different view on how to make free trade agreements good for America than maybe previous administrations had had. And so we're going to do everything we can not to be political in this webinar. Having said that, we're going to read some Trump tweets right now, okay?
Trump tweets.
Hashtag. So before President Trump was elected, one of his big campaign promises was, I will renegotiate NAFTA. Because of those reasons we talked about, right? Production of things like not just food, but cars, especially is a good example, was definitely going abroad. And so then you had states like Michigan, towns like Detroit that were just becoming decrepit because the industries that really used to prop them up left the country. And NAFTA was a big reason for that because it made it easier for those to leave the country. Great for consumers, right? Because it meant that our cars were more affordable. But if you don't have a job, it doesn't matter how affordable your car is. So that was one of the big promises that he made. And he definitely did that. After he was elected, one of the kind of first out of the gate things that happened was he started talking to Mexico and Canada to say, look, if we don't renegotiate this thing, the U.S. is just going to terminate it. We're just going to pull out of it. And that's sort of the position that this administration takes. It's very much a, we don't need you, so we're just going to
work well for us, or we're
exactly.
Out.
And so he, basically threatened to terminate the agreement. Instead, I agreed to renegotiate the agreement if we reached a fair deal, and then if not, we're going to terminate. So it was very adversarial there for a while. And again, that's a negotiation tactic, right? If you start strong and you go in and you say, we don't need you, we can go it alone, then that kind of puts you in the driver's seat of that negotiation.
I think you wrote a whole book about that,
actually. Indeed, you did.
Okay.
Art of the Deal. Great. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. I could not.
I know.
Right, okay.
Non-political.
I've never read it. So anyway, and he did the same thing, not just with NAFTA, but also with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. But with that one, we just left. We went ahead and left TPP in favor of more bilateral trade agreements, as opposed to those multilateral, that laundry list of countries.
So just a couple of countries, well, just two countries specifically instead of that.
That's right.
Mass.
That's right. And so TPP, actually, we left. We no longer are part of TPP, which means that actually TPP no longer exists. So the remaining countries have already renegotiated their own trade agreement, which is a ridiculous acronym that I don't even remember, but it's like 6 letters.
We're not in it.
We're not in it. But we did, after pulling out of TPP, go straight to Japan. And
to a bilateral.
Exactly.
Because it's two.
Japan. So that was one of the first real new free trade agreements that the administration was able to finalize. So signed, sealed, delivered. And it made sense to go to Japan because Japan is the 4th largest buyer of U.S. ag goods, and they buy a lot of other goods too, but for ag especially, we were really happy that Japan was on the radar. And Japan also is, as a country, kind of outspoken that they like American goods. They'll say that, they'll prove that, and so, hey, we're all about that. And so the free trade agreement that we've signed with Japan is actually really, really great for agriculture. Beef tariffs have fallen significantly from about 38, 39% to more like 26%. So that opens some more markets for our beef farmers there in Japan.
And poultry common nuts.
That's right. Yes, thanks for that one, Katie. We're going to fix that before we post this.
I'll buy it.
So poultry fell also from about 12% to more like 8%. So that's important
okay,
too.
That's good.
Yeah, and then a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we grow in the U.S. are going to be completely tariff-free. So a lot easier for us to take those over and get those to the Japanese market. Also have some better access to the dairy market just in terms of quotas and how much we can fill of the Japanese dairy quota versus how much we were able to fill before. Quotas are really complicated, and so we won't get into them too much here in this presentation, but just know that that's another term that if you use it, you should know what it means. And so that's a good example of one that we've been really successful in. So pulling out the TPP, we were still able to get a great deal with Japan. NAFTA's been a little more complicated. So another thing you've probably heard in the news is the USMCA. You may also have seen a few like parody dances. So instead of YMCA, it's USMCA.
Haven't, but might have to Google it.
Yes, definitely. You Google that, go on YouTube. It's a good use of your time. And so we talked about NAFTA. What was it? The free trade agreement between U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and basically established just a zone of free trade between those three countries. Makes a lot of sense because they touch one another, right? We're all connected.
Yeah, we're connected.
Why not create those trades of kinds of trades? So why did we leave it? Well, it was old. It was 20 plus years old, and so markets and technology and what we produce looks a lot different now than it did 20 years ago.
Year to year.
Yeah, I mean, even something as simple as like cybersecurity, right, and privacy, those kinds of things have been a really big deal in USMCA. And then some provisions really were unfair to U.S. markets. Agriculture had a cool perspective on it because it was great for us. It did a lot for us. It was a good deal for us. But other markets didn't feel that way. Other industries did it. The automobile industry is a really good example of that. Other manufacturing, steel manufacturing, that kind of thing. And so where we saw agricultural exports quadruple really through NAFTA, so from about $8 billion a year to $38 billion a year between those countries. Other industries didn't see that as much, and they saw some more job loss, and they just definitely saw ways that NAFTA could be improved. So that's what President Trump and the administration said we're going to do. We're going to pull out of the agreement now because there's things that are wrong with it. We're going to fix those things and then come back to the table with that. And so that's what USMCA has really done. And by and large, you probably, if you Google it in the news, it's very difficult to find negative news on USMCA because it really is a great agreement. It's a very positive agreement, and we'll focus on why it's good for ag. But other industries are really happy about it as well. All of the chambers of commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Arizona Chamber of Commerce have come out just in full-hearted support of USMCA. So it's a good deal. Maintains tariff-free ag trade, so that's what we had under NAFTA as well. Ag products are going in and out tariff-free for the most part. The other thing it fixes is that there were some barriers to access in the Canadian dairy industry, especially. Canada would impose a certain kind of tariff on U.S. milk. They wouldn't let U.S. milk come in because of quotas again, and gave U.S. less of their quota than they should have had, or that we believe they should have had. So we have better access to that import quota now, and they've eliminated that additional tariff. Another thing that was happening in Canada is that they were grading U.S. wheat unfairly. If you were at the National SFA Convention, not this year, but 2 years ago, you probably heard President Trump talk about this, and he literally said, I have no idea what it means, but you all probably do. So one of my favorite moments.
Maybe you still don't.
Maybe you still don't. But basically what was happening is Canada has a grading system just like we do for wheat products. And so they give wheat a quality grade. And obviously the higher the quality grade, the higher the price goes. And so when U.S. wheat came into Canada, they were automatically decreasing the quality grade just because it wasn't from Canada. So even if that U.S. wheat was equal in quality, better in quality to Canadian wheat, it was still receiving a lower price because it had that automatic, it's U.S. and so it's shipping. Exactly. So this eliminates that. No more unfair grading scheme in Canadian wheat. And another thing when we talked about those, what do we want to bring across into our country and what do we want to make sure not bugs, we updated a lot of those sanitary standards to be more based on science, and that has actually a lot to do with the increased use of GMOs, because I think there are certain countries, maybe not the U.S. or maybe not the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, but definitely some other countries who would maybe automatically say that maybe a GMO crop shouldn't come into their country because of science or because of bad science or poor phytosanitary standards. And so we're making sure that that's not going to happen through NAFTA. And so we're making sure that all of our requirements for these sanitary standards are science-based and not fear-based, which is great. So because of all these differences, we're expecting that about more than $2 billion increase in agriculture exports between our three countries, which is fantastic, right? Because when you're looking at agriculture right now with decreased crop prices and markets are really tough to access, anything more that we can get for our guys is great. It's especially good for Arizona as a border state, right? Because we're so close to Mexico. A lot of our markets are integrated, which means that we'll buy our seed from Mexico and they'll buy chemicals from us, and we're moving these things across the border. And so if USMCA or NAFTA was not in existence, it'd be really hard for those kinds of integrations to happen. So we're very excited about USMCA and the potential that it has. And so is it done? What do we have to do to get it done? It's close. About a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, the USMCA was signed by all three countries.
I remember that.
So what that means is that the terms of the trade treaty were signed. So they kind of said, these are what we're going to be good with. This is what we're going to agree to. Then all of the presidents of the three countries had to take it back to their countries to get ratification from their respective legislatures, right? And so in the U.S., how that works is first the administration submits basically something that says, hey, we want to ratify this. Congress, you're on notice. So once that happens, a lot of negotiation kind of started to go and a lot of wheels started to move. Because even though the countries have agreed to the terms, there's still some room for movement and some room for improvement if we feel like that needs to happen within the treaty itself. And that's where Congress is coming in and saying, hey, they have their laundry list of requests. We want this, we want that, depending on who you're talking to in Congress. So that's still the point that we're in. If you follow the news on this at all, you probably saw that I think it was yesterday, Speaker Pelosi issued a statement basically saying, hey, we're really close. We think we've come to terms on things that we weren't okay with. We understand that it's important to pass this, but we still have a little more work to do. So what we're waiting for now is for everybody in Congress to say, okay, yep, I'm on board with this, I can vote for it, because then the Trump administration will submit the actual legislation that will implement the USMCA and allow us to ratify it as a trade agreement. Once they do that, though, there's a 60-day deadline for Congress to act. And so if they don't act within that 60 days, that means that we basically can't sign the agreement, kind of have to go back to the drawing board. And so that's why we're waiting kind of on eggshells to see, okay, when's the right time to submit that? And when's the right time, to really make that official.
Right.
So it still hasn't been done.
Kind of seems like a slam dunk. I mean, it makes sense how it's going. So what's the holdup?
As normal, the holdup is politics.
So
your world, my world, not Katie's. Sometimes I envy her. So right now, we still have those congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle that are working on specific terms that maybe have pinpointed really detailed parts of the bill that they don't like or of the treaty that they don't like. Not that they don't like the entire thing or the idea, but it's just like, here's this provision that we think is going to impact an industry in a certain way or a person in a certain way. The other speculation that has been pretty rampant is that we have an election coming up in 2020, and that sort of messes everything up in a lot of ways. And
don't want somebody to get a win.
No, exactly. And so right now, the White House is part of that election in 2020. It is a presidential election. And so the party that has to vote on this, or the House that has to vote on this, the Democrats are in control of the House, whereas the Republican Party is in control of the White House. And so it's going to be really difficult for the party that's not in control of the White House to give the White House a big win to campaign on as we're going into that 2020 election cycle. And so I know. That's why we're encouraged, by statements coming out of Speaker Pelosi's office, who's not from the Republican Party, about we understand this is important and we're close. But statements are kind of worth the paper that they're printed on until you see some action. So one of the things that Farm Bureau is doing a really, really widespread push right now is for you to contact your congressman and tell them, hey, We need USMCA. It's very important to Arizona.
It's
important to agriculture. Katie got that email. Hopefully some of your ag teachers did as well. But if you go to fb.org, they have a whole action center set up that if you wanted to send that email with just a couple clicks of a button, you absolutely could. So there's my pitch. All right. So it matters, of course, to pass USMCA because of all the economic stuff we just talked about, right? Mm-hmm. But there's another sort of underlying reason that it matters that is worth pointing out. And it's that everybody, the rest of the world, is kind of sitting back to see what's going on with the USMCA. How is America going to do this? Because if we can't get this passed with our neighbors who we've had free trade agreements with before, that kind of signals to the rest of the country that we're not serious about doing this, and that we can't get along long enough, or that we can't work together long enough to make these free trade agreements happen. We're really looking at USMCA as sort of going to pull out the plug of the bathtub, right? And then once we get that done, a lot of these other bilateral or, one or two country trade agreements are going to happen a lot more quickly. But right now, with USMCA as a holdup, a lot of other things are stalled as well.
If I can see.
That's right. So that's our current free trade agreement primer, and gives you probably more information than you ever wanted to know.
Well, I know that the USMCA isn't the only big trade issue that's out there.
Yeah,
right?
No, that's absolutely right. And so with the last few minutes that we have, I just wanted really quickly to talk about sort of the trade wars.
Dun, dun, dun.
I love this graphic, right? Just
really good.
So dramatic. It's really good. So you hear, I'm sure, a lot about trade wars as well in the media because it's, flashy and it's big, and it is actually a big deal. It's not just a big headline. It's actually something that's impacting, especially our family farmers on the ground as we talk. And so right now, the Chinese trade wars are probably the biggest one that you hear about. And what that refers to when we say trade wars just means it's a back and forth imposition of tariffs. So China will say, we don't like what's happening. We're going to impose a tariff on these products, and the U.S. will say, well,
fine, we're going to do it on these ones.
Exactly. Very much.
Temper tantrum.
Kind of like that. Hopefully there's a little bit more, economic research behind the temper tantrum than the ones I typically throw, but, whatever happens. And so, yeah, that's basically what will happen. And then this year in August, we really hit home hard because China announced that not only is it going to impose certain tariffs, it's just going to stop buying U.S. ag products altogether. And it wasn't all U.S. ag products. It was a long kind of laundry list of them. The ones that mattered a lot for Arizona were beef, pecans, because we do grow quite a few pecans in Arizona. There were some fruits and vegetables on there as well. And so that's sort of when, especially the agricultural industry said, whoa, whoa, whoa. We get it. We need to have strong trade relationships, and we need to show our strength on the trade market. But now it's hurting my bottom line, and now it's impacting my pocketbook and my ability to have access to those markets in future times. So what are we going to do about this? And what we're doing to help, some of it's been more helpful, some of it's been less helpful. And the kind of in the public stuff is the country-to-country negotiations. So you probably heard a few months ago now that President Trump and the Chinese president sat down together, and they're doing talks, and they're trying to have these talks ongoing. Sometimes they schedule them, and then there's a big fallout, and then they don't happen. And that looks really bad. Or they happen, and they say, yeah, everything's great, and then there's fallout afterwards. Bless you. So those have really, I would say, it's fair to categorize them as largely unsuccessful up to this point. And so to the point of, our farmers and ranchers saying, wait a minute, guys, this is impacting my businesses today. What the government has said is, all right, you need to trust us that we're doing better for you in the long term, and that we're going to make our trade relationship with China better in the future. But because we understand it's impacting you now, we're going to help you out in the meantime. And so the government authorized millions of dollars. Yeah. Okay. So millions of dollars in federal payments for farmers who've been impacted by these trade wars. And those are literally direct payments based on what you're producing, what you're growing, and where you're growing it. So the prices are different depending on where you're growing it.
And I think it's important to recognize and point out that when we're talking about millions of dollars, that doesn't mean that the farmers and ranchers of these products are getting rich off of what's happening from the government. This is just making up for what they're losing during this holdout.
Yeah, or at least trying to make up for what they're doing. You know, it's millions of dollars, but think about how many millions of acres those dollars have to be spread out over. It's a drop in the bucket, very much so. And so it's important to recognize that not only is this not going to make any of our farmers rich by any means, but it just might get them to the next year. The other thing that farmers have been very consistent is saying is that we really appreciate this aid, but we'd much rather have the trade, because at the long run, it's those markets and it's those business relationships that are going to make them successful and sustainable for years to come, not just sort of the Band-Aid that covers it up. So the question that AACEM just gave us is, why does China keep imposing tariffs on U.S. imports? So the bigger picture, the bigger question for that, or the bigger answer to that, is that we are right now posturing for trade superiority between the two countries. And so I don't actually know who the first country was to kind of impose like the first, this is what we're doing. But basically the countries are coming together and trying to say, you are going to trade to us on our terms versus we're going to trade to you on your terms. And so because these are the two really biggest industrial countries in the world, they have the power to do that. The U.S. and China have the power to go back and forth. So right now, basically, if there's a tariff imposed, it's because it's retaliatory. So if the U.S. says, China, you're not treating us fairly, which means that we're not going to bring your products into the United States unless they have a 25% tariff, then China will say, okay, cool, we're going to retaliate and put a 25% tariff on U.S. products. And so now that I'm thinking about it, I think it really was the U.S. that first said, okay, we're in a bad position with China, and so we're going to prevent their goods from coming in. Yeah. And so the rest of that has been retaliatory. But again, it goes back to that idea, right, of free trade is great as long as we're doing it the right way, and as long as we're not doing it in a way that harms American workers and that harms American industries, because if we can bring in super, super cheap goods from another country, we're going to stop making those goods here in America. And so people who are employed to make those goods no longer have a job.
So it doesn't matter how cheap the product is.
That's right. That's right. So that's really why China continues to do this. It really sort of was, we started it. And the reason behind that is that we want a stronger trade relationship and we want a better trade relationship with that country. And so right now what we're trying to do is make sure that farms and ranches aren't collateral damage in that negotiation. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it does lead to kind of a fun ag issues question if you want, and that's, is this going to be helpful? Is this a good idea? Look, Katie, you find fun some places, I find other places, whatever. But yeah, so is it helpful? And there's going to be folks that say, yeah, of course it is, because you've got to be tough now if you're going to be successful later on. You know, China is a country that has the potential to manufacture a ton of stuff for really, really cheap, but we need to make sure that we're protecting American jobs and American industries.
Fight the battle and end it now, so we're not doing it in 2 years.
It's sort of a rip the Band-Aid off scenario, right? And then there are folks that are going to be saying, no, not so much. You can't pay bills with patriotism is a phrase that I've heard a few times that I think is insightful, and it's definitely true. The other, from agriculture's perspective, you know, agricultural markets and market relationships are formed over a matter of years. And so when you start to have supply chains, beef is a really good example, right? So if you've got beef going to a particular country and all of a sudden that market is cut off for whatever reason, like a tariff or import embargo because they just are mad at your country.
We now have a surplus.
You have that surplus, and you can't just go somewhere really quickly to figure out where to put that surplus. The other issue with that is that China doesn't not need beef anymore. So they're still going to be buying beef. They're just going to be buying it from another country. And so then they start to build those relationships with that other country, and you start to spend capital building those relationships. And you start to figure out how you're transporting things, and you spend capital transporting things.
And if that works out really well, are they going to come back?
Exactly. You're not just going to flip that at the end of the day when, okay, we finally figured this out, because you've invested a lot as a business in that. And so these markets aren't something that's just going to recover in the moment that this war is over. It's going to take a lot of time. And so if we're, one, in a big war with China, and two, we can't pass the USMCA, and so we're not being able to negotiate these free trade agreements with other countries who might actually take what we are producing, it's just a really downward spiral really quickly. And so that could be an interesting one to go back and forth and say what's working and what's not, I think. So that's kind of all of our content. And we do, of course, have resources for you like we always do. The bulk of them this time are from American Farm Bureau. They have a really, really awesome team of economists at American Farm Bureau who I trust quite a bit. And so they do a lot of great work for us in terms of breaking down these trade agreements, breaking down the issues. And just they're super smart people. And so always happy to use our American Farm Bureau staff. And then also I found a good article on Forbes, which sometimes I like to just throw out a non-ag source because we'd like to have another perspective. But it's good to hear non-ag sources talking about why trade is so important for agriculture. So that one I thought was a good article as well. That's all I have, but we do have a couple minutes if anyone else has questions from the audience. AAC, thanks a lot for your questions through this. It always helps us out to have a little more real-time interaction, and glad you're able to watch. But Katie, any wrapping up comments?
I just want to thank you for taking the time to address this topic, because I think a lot of us hear it in the news and things that maybe make sense. Yeah, let's do this. We don't think about that ripple effect and what effect it's having on really the foundation, the people who are making us what we are. So I think that was some great insight and information, and hopefully you guys choose to look into it a little bit more. I know I would really like to see some of these webinar topics become the ag issues as we move into spring. I'll be curious if it has any impact. And where you guys take it. So hopefully these are helpful to you. So I know we'll see you guys again next month. We don't know about what yet.
Yeah, we do. We do know about what. I'm going to teach you how the legislature works in Arizona. We're going to learn how a bill becomes a law.
Can I sing the song when we get there?
Yes,
okay, not today. I have to memorize it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if you maybe modify the lyrics to be Arizona specific, I'd be
cool with that. Yes. I got a microphone. You better be here next month. How a bill becomes a law.
That's
we'll
right.
see you guys next time.
Thanks, guys.